Now that we've got a sense of just the general structure of the codes of ethics and codes of conduct that are thought to apply to morticians and coroners, uh, we want to focus a little more closely on the issue of deceased rights and the idea that the deceased have certain rights that impose obligations upon morticians and coroners. Um, I think it's safe to say that there's more or less widespread agreement that certain ways of handling corpses or dead bodies is morally inappropriate. Um, there are the obvious cases that are rare, but because of their sensational nature, people tend to remember them. Um, you know, Anytime anyone engages in any kind of sort of intimate sexual activity with corpses, and sort of interpret that any way you like. Obviously, that we almost everyone finds that just completely repugnant and disgusting and morally awful. Um, any kind of physical sort of abuse, I guess, if you were to sort of hit or strike the body of a dead person, we'd probably find that similarly objectionable. Although maybe less objectionable than the other sorts of behavior. Although I'm not sure. I'm not sure. You would have to see what you think about that. And it might be interesting to see how people react differently to those kinds of cases. But the point here is just that there is some agreement about what is not appropriate when it comes to the treatment and handling of dead bodies. One thing that we should think about is what the arguments are for those sorts of standards. And if there even are any arguments, because it may be that we have this sense of how we want the bodies of deceased persons to be treated, but we don't have a good sort of ethical basis for those standards. One thing that's sort of interesting in speaking with morticians about this is when I bring this issue up, they basically agree and say, look, I was trained to treat the body in a particular way, and that's how I know what to do, is that somebody else told me what to do. One thing that I find surprising about that is that that's sort of what the attitude and the environment was in medicine prior to the 1960s and 70s, when the idea emerged that, hey, we should probably have external oversight over what physicians are doing. Prior to that time period and that realization, there was this sort of internal we know best how we ought to act kind of attitude. And you have the same kind of thing among morticians. So one thing we want to do is think about whether there actually are arguments for the sorts of conduct that they seem professionally committed to, or whether this is all just sort of loosely held together by a kind of professional training that's going on. And I think it's fair to start with, as I mentioned in the last lecture clip, the Code of Ethics from the National Funeral Directors Association. In their section on deceased rights, they give really, really vague suggestions that I already touched on. Care for the deceased with the highest respect and dignity, treat them with proper care and dignity, and keep them properly covered at all times. Notice we saw lots of words like dignity and proper. What we don't see is specific instructions. Don't have sex with the body. Don't hit the body in the face. Don't, read the dead person's stories before you go home. Don't eat lunch, in the room. Things like that. And yet we probably, with the exception of maybe the lunch thing, probably you would all agree that everything I just said is absolutely what we want coroners to do and what we want morticians to do when they're handling dead bodies. And yet it's not obvious from this code of ethics that any of that is implied. So let's take a look at just some general problems, because we might worry that this standard is first incredibly vague, because as I just mentioned, it doesn't tell us specifically what kind of care is and is not appropriate. That's something you always want in a sort of professional code of conduct. You want specific rules about what can and cannot be done. In medicine, there's this idea of informed consent, and the rules are not simply make sure your patient chooses their treatment regimen autonomously or respect patient autonomy. It's much more specific. Get informed consent. Here's what that is. Here's what you have. Here are the steps to ensuring that informed consent has been obtained. Here's the paperwork. Here's who can administer the consent process. It's very, very specific. This code is not like that at all. You might also worry that this way of putting it is just unhelpfully circular, because it assumes that you already understand what proper care is. And in fact, when you're trying to figure out what proper care is, one place you might look is at the professional code of conduct. In this case, you're not going to be able to do that because the code of conduct itself assumes that you already know what kind of care is appropriate. So there's a sense in which this is just sort of a circular explanation of codes of conduct. It says, give proper care and respect, and proper care and respect is just whatever you regard as proper, and that doesn't help. That doesn't help us in cases where we don't know what we're supposed to do, what we can and cannot do. You might also worry that this code is simply inadequately defined because it relies on these moral notions like highest respect and dignity. And although we have a basic idea of what those terms suggest, we don't really know what those mean when we're talking about the body of a deceased person. Those are concepts that are typically applied to living humans, and maybe even full-blown persons, not just sort of anyone who is a human, but sort of full-grown adult moral agents. So the concern here is just that there's a sort of assumption that we understand what these moral terms mean within a context of working with the bodies of deceased persons, and in fact we don't know, and we really don't know what that means, and we'll see why that's true in just a moment. Now you might think that even though these professional standards are sort of vague and circular in all these ways, that's okay, because maybe there's a really robust legal standard, and that all morticians need to do is make sure that they're in line with that legal standard. Well, here's the Ohio statute regarding misdemeanor and felony abuse of a corpse. So let's look first at it's labeled A. This is misdemeanor abuse of a corpse. It says, no person except as authorized by law shall treat a human corpse in a way that the person knows would outrage reasonable family sensibilities. Now let's stop before we look at felony abuse of a corpse. Two things I think are worth noting here. One is that the standard for what is and is not appropriate with regard to treatment of a corpse, or what is and is not legal, depends on what sort of most families would be okay with. So there's a kind of reasonable person standard being appealed to here. Look, when you're trying to determine whether treating a corpse in a particular way is morally appropriate, you need to think about what sort of a normal, sensible family would approve of or disapprove of. What's surprising about that, I think, is just that it's up to sort of what families would find objectionable to determine what actually is objectionable. So we have this, there's a kind of sort of relativism built into this, in that, if our attitudes became radically different, where we no longer saw sort of, intimate sexual contact with a corpse as objectionable, like, had the world evolved differently and nobody thought that was wrong, everybody was sort of cool with necrophilia, according to this statute, that wouldn't count as abuse of a corpse because it doesn't violate reasonable family sensibilities. You might think that's shocking because you might think that there is something inherently wrong with treating a dead body that way. This standard does not capture that intuition at all. It says that, right and wrong with regard to abuse of a corpse depends on what families actually would find objectionable, or what we can reasonably assume they would find objectionable. The other thing that's worth noting here is just that if a legal body authorizes it, even conduct that would outrage family sensibilities is considered appropriate. Now this is probably going to apply to cases where we're talking about maybe doing autopsies on very young children, or exhuming a body, or something like that. It may be that most families would be outraged by the thought of having their 4-year-old having an autopsy done on their 4-year-old. If the law says no, we have to do this, then that's not going to count as abuse of a corpse, even though it does, outrage family sensibilities. And similar type of analysis if we're talking about exhuming a body. Even if most families would find that objectionable, if the law says we have to do it, then it's not misdemeanor abuse of a corpse. All right, let's move now to felony abuse of a corpse, which is under the bullet point that begins with the letter B. No person except as authorized by law shall treat a human corpse in a way that would outrage reasonable community sensibilities. Now, it's not entirely clear to me why we have this move from family sensibilities to community sensibilities. It may be that there are certain kinds of conduct that families would find objectionable, but that the public at large would not. I don't offhand know what those things would be. It may be things like these sort of troubling autopsies or body exhuming or something like that. But what's odd is that the stipulation that if this is authorized by law, that seems to, sort of cover that sort of case. So you might wonder why community standards are relevant when we're talking about felony abuse of a corpse, and why it's family standards when we're talking about misdemeanor abuse of a corpse. I don't know the answer to that question. Overall, this is just sort of a very odd statute, and the reason that I point it out and I like to draw people's attention to it is because it is so surprising, like what the actual basis of the illegality actually is. That it's not anything about corpses, right? It's not as though any of their rights are being violated, or they're not being made. It's not that they're being made worse off or harmed or disrespected. It's that families and communities would be upset by the conduct that's going on. And you might think that that's strange, and it sort of flies in the face of this idea that the deceased have certain rights, because when we talk about, from a legal point of view, what makes this conduct, unlawful, it's not deceased rights that are being appealed to. It's these sort of community and familial standards. It may turn out that this is not as sort of surprising or bizarre as it may first seem, because, and one thing that we want to sort of draw attention to in this module is just that the standards, the ethical standards regarding living persons, don't apply very directly or obviously to dead bodies. So when we think about the notion of having rights, one way to think about rights is to say, look, the beings that have rights are beings that are able to make a claim on other people. They're able to make certain kinds of demands. This is why people who have this view about rights tend to think that only persons have rights. They don't sort of buy into the idea of animal rights, because animals can't actually make claims on others. They can only have claims made on their behalf. That's the other way we might understand rights, as having, in terms of having claims made on your behalf. It's not clearly a dead body can't make a claim on others. It's not clear whether claims can be made on their behalf, because the notion of on your behalf is a little bit bizarre when we're talking about a dead body, because you can ask the question, on whose behalf is this claim being made? Well, Charlie. Well, Charlie's dead. Who are you making this claim on behalf of? The body? Okay, is there some difference between the body and, a lamp, where I can make a claim on behalf of this object, but not that object? And you might think, yeah, there is a difference. There's a huge difference. But then the question is, what is the difference? Fill it in. And I think that's one thing that's sort of odd, at least to me, about some of this literature and some of these ways of thinking about this issue, is there's this sort of implicit assumption that there is something different about bodies that doesn't apply to other kinds of objects, and we don't really know what it is, what the difference actually is. I mean, it's got to be something like, well, they used to be a person, and here's what that implies. But we do need to fill that account in some way. So that's one thing you should think about, is how you would actually fill in an account like that to explain why it's not okay to treat a dead body just like you would any other object. Another standard that doesn't obviously apply to living persons, or apply to dead bodies that does apply to living persons, is this notion of sort of violating desires. I mean, that's one thing we saw early in the semester when we talked about what makes death bad for the person who dies. Looper pointed out, look, death thwarts your desires. That's what makes it bad for you. That's what makes, in fact, Looper says, that's what makes anything bad for you. Well, then, the way a dead body is treated isn't going to thwart any desires, at least not obviously. Unless we want to say something like, well, if a person has the desire not to have their body treated in certain ways when they're dead, then that desire gets thwarted when they actually are treated that way. The Epicurean, of course, would say, yeah, and how is that bad for them? I don't explain to me how that is a bad thing for them and not just a bad thing, because those aren't really the same. You can't really talk about dead bodies having interests that matter to them. For one thing, it's not clear whether dead bodies have interests, especially if you think having interests requires consciousness. And the notion that these interests would matter to them is going to be sort of similarly problematic. And in fact, maybe even more problematic than other kinds of controversial claims about rights. People talk about animal rights, occasionally you hear people speak about the rights of ecosystems or species or something like that. And it's difficult, sort of along a sliding scale, to explain how those beings can have interests that matter to them. Not so hard for animals, tough for plants, really tough for something like an ecosystem or a species, but maybe even tougher for a dead body, because a dead body is much more like a inanimate object than even a plant, right? Because plants still have a certain kind of sort of vitality. There are processes going on. There are things plants are doing which advance what is good for them, even if they're not aware of it. And dead bodies don't do anything like that. So that's kind of where we want to leave our discussion of deceased rights, is thinking about, okay, we have this idea that there are certain ways that it would be wrong to treat a dead body. Is it because of family and community standards, like the legal statute suggests? Is the law getting it right here? Or is it that there really is something about dead bodies that makes them importantly different from other kinds of inanimate objects? And if it's just that this used to be a person, we really do need to know, like, why that gives rise to rights, and why these notions like respect and dignity still apply, even though we're not talking about a person. We're talking about the dead body of what used to be a person. All right, so with that said, go ahead and take care of the question. It's about the basis of the legal standard and what is maybe a little bit surprising about it. And then we're going to move on to talking more specifically about mortician coroners and the kinds of sort of specific, unique ethical challenges they face.